My name is Tegan Woods, a sergeant in the United States Army. In my world, an order is absolute. But I never thought I'd receive one at my own family's dinner table. We were at the 1789 restaurant in Georgetown, the air thick with the scent of power and expensive wine. My mother, Diane, slid a thick, white envelope across the mahogany table. Her voice was as cold as the diamond on her finger. "This is for the best, Tegan, for all of us." My sister, Avery, raised her phone, a smug smile on her face, ready to document my downfall. Inside wasn't a gift. It was a legal document, a notice of familial waiver, stripping me of my inheritance and officially disowning me from the Woods clan. My father just nodded, his gaze as sharp as a closed negotiation. They thought they were giving me my final order. They had no idea they had just initiated their own court-martial. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you believe that silence is sometimes the most powerful weapon. The air inside 1789 was a currency I'd never learned to spend. It was old money, old power, clinging to the dark wood paneling and the starched white tablecloths. As a soldier, I'm trained to assess a room, to identify threats and assets, exits and obstacles. Here, in the heart of Washington, D.C.'s elite territory, I felt like a soldier in civilian clothes deep behind enemy lines. My plain black dress was a quiet camouflage amidst a sea of Brioni suits and Carolina Herrera gowns. The men wore their power like a second skin, their quiet conversations about upcoming bills and judicial appointments weaving a web of influence that covered the entire city. I watched my family operate within this ecosystem with a detached, analytical precision. My father, Charles Woods, didn't need to speak to the sommelier. A subtle, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist was enough to have a bottle of vintage Bordeaux brought to the table. He was a K Street legend, a man who treated every interaction, including those with his children, as a transaction. To my left, my mother, Diane, flashed a perfectly manicured smile at a senator seated at the adjacent table. Her value was measured in successful galas and the pristine image of her family in the pages of Washingtonian magazine. She was the gatekeeper of our family's social standing, and I was a liability she could no longer afford. And then there was Avery. My older sister sat across from me, her posture immaculate, her sharp blue eyes darting from her phone to me and back again. She checked her device not like a bored millennial, but like a general reviewing a strategic map before an assault. She was everything they wanted: a ruthless corporate lawyer, a graduate of Georgetown law, a perfect reflection of their values. I was the anomaly, the stubborn miscalculation in their otherwise perfect dynastic equation. The silence at our table wasn't comfortable. It was tactical, a weaponized quiet that amplified the pressure suffocating me. The waiter placed a plate of seared scallops in front of me. I picked up my fork, my movements measured, just as the performance began. My father cleared his throat, a sound that commanded attention across the entire room. He placed his hands on the table, a practiced gesture of authority, but he wouldn't look at me. "Tegan," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "your mother and I have been thinking a great deal about the family legacy, about the paths we all choose in life." It was a speech, not a conversation. He spoke of tradition, of responsibility, of the Woods name as a brand that needed careful management. My mother picked up the thread seamlessly, her tone sweet but laced with venom. "It's about our image, dear. About expectations. We've always supported your choices, but there comes a time when we must protect the integrity of what we've built." Every word was a tiny, poisoned needle, a subtle reminder of how I had failed to meet those expectations. I could feel the eyes of the other patrons on us, sensing the drama unfolding. Through it all, Avery just sat there, that faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. She looked like someone watching a play for the second time, savoring the moment she knew would lead to the inevitable, tragic climax. For anyone in my position, this would have been a form of psychological torture. This slow, deliberate dismantling of your worth, wrapped in the language of love and concern. It was a tactic I'd seen used in interrogation rooms, designed to break you down before the final blow. And then, the final blow came. My mother reached into her designer handbag and produced a crisp, heavy envelope. She placed it on the table and, with a single, perfectly manicured finger, slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of me. The air went still. "We feel this is for the best, Tegan," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. I looked at the envelope. It was made of thick, expensive cardstock, the kind used for wedding invitations or declarations of war. My name, Tegan Woods, was typed on the front in a severe, impersonal font. My fingers felt numb as I reached for it. The paper was cold, shockingly cold, under my touch. I broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of legal-sized paper. My eyes scanned the dense text, the dry, unforgiving language of lawyers stripping away every ounce of sentiment. The heading read, "Notice of Familial Waiver." My gaze jumped from phrase to phrase. "Hereby relinquishes all rights, responsibilities, and connections. Waives any and all claims to inheritance, property, and familial association." It was a death sentence for a relationship that had been dying for years. It was an official execution. In that moment of profound silent shock, a small sound cut through the haze. A whisper. I looked up and saw Avery, her phone still raised, leaning toward my mother. "Got it," she whispered, her voice filled with triumph. The look on her face, perfect. The coldness in my veins turned to ice. It wasn't enough to disown me. It wasn't enough to sever me from the family. They had to turn my deepest moment of humiliation into a spectacle, a trophy for my sister to capture and keep. I was no longer a daughter or a sister. I was a piece of entertainment. A problem that had finally been solved. Something shifted inside me then. The hurt was there, a deep, sharp pain in my chest. But years of military training had forged something harder over my heart. You don't cry on the battlefield. You don't scream. You assess, you adapt, you act. I folded the document. Not clumsily, but with a soldier's precision. I made a perfect rectangle, the creases sharp and exact. I placed it gently back on the table, next to my untouched scallops. Then, I pushed my chair back, the sound echoing slightly in the tense silence that had fallen over our table. I stood up, straightened my dress, and looked each of my family members directly in the eye. First, Avery, whose triumphant smile faltered under my steady gaze. Then my mother, whose composure cracked just enough to reveal a flicker of uncertainty. Finally, my father, whose negotiating mask couldn't quite hide his surprise. My voice, when it came, was level, monotone, devoid of the emotion they so desperately wanted to film. Message received and understood. I held their stunned gazes for one final second. Then I turned my back on them and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't storm out. I walked with a steady, measured pace, my back straight, my head held high, leaving them behind in a tomb of their own making. A dead silence broken only by the clinking of silverware from other, happier tables. They fired the first shot. But they had no idea I'd been mapping this entire battlefield for years. The walk away from 1789 wasn't a retreat, it was a tactical withdrawal. Every step on the cold Georgetown pavement was a deliberate move away from the wreckage. That envelope wasn't a sudden attack. It was simply the final piece of ordnance in a long, drawn-out war of attrition against my spirit. The battlefield my father didn't know I'd been mapping was my own memory. A private museum where every exhibit was a quiet act of dismissal. A carefully preserved moment of being made to feel worthless. My collection begins with Christmas. Christmas in the Woods household wasn't about warmth or togetherness. It was a strategic investment in our designated futures. I remember the year Avery was accepted into Georgetown Law. Under the enormous, professionally decorated tree in our living room, her gifts were a testament to her path. A gleaming leather briefcase from Gurkha, an all-expenses-paid summer internship in London, a first-edition set of books on constitutional law. Each gift was a brick in the gilded road they were paving for her. That was the same year I told them I wanted to enlist in the army. The silence that followed my announcement was heavier than any argument could have been. That Christmas, my gifts were different. While Avery unwrapped her future, I received a collection of porcelain dolls dressed as every American president. They were beautiful, expensive, and utterly meaningless to me. As I held the blank, painted face of Abraham Lincoln, my mother leaned in, her perfume enveloping me in a cloud of disappointment. "At least this way you can be near powerful men, darling," she'd whispered with a smile. It was a masterclass in sophisticated contempt. A gift that wasn't a gift at all, but a beautifully wrapped message telling me how profoundly I had let them down. Another exhibit in my museum is a memory that still feels sharp enough to cut. I was 22, fresh out of advanced training, and had just been awarded the Army Commendation Medal for my role in a reconnaissance mission that saved my platoon from walking into an ambush. My hands were shaking when I called home from a satellite phone in a dusty tent halfway across the world. I was so proud, so desperate for a single crumb of genuine validation. My mother picked up, and I could immediately hear the telltale clinking of glasses and the high-pitched chatter of a DC cocktail party in the background. "Tegan, how are you, darling?" she asked, her voice distracted. I told her about the medal, my voice cracking with a hope I should have known better than to feel. There was a pause. I heard her say to someone nearby, "Just one moment, Margaret, it's Tegan." Then back to me. "Oh, that's wonderful, honey. A little medal, how sweet." The words dripped with condescension. "A little medal. Listen, I have to run. The florist is here with the arrangements for the fundraiser tomorrow. We'll talk soon." The line went dead. I stood there in the suffocating heat, listening to the dial tone. I had helped save the lives of a dozen soldiers, and my achievement couldn't compete for 30 seconds of her attention against a flower delivery. I learned a brutal lesson that day. In her world, my sacrifices would always be weighed against the floral arrangements, and the flowers would always win. But the centerpiece of my collection, the exhibit that casts the longest shadow, is from a dinner during one of my leaves. My father had invited a retired four-star general, a potential client for his lobbying firm, to our home. For the first time, I thought this could be it. A bridge between my two worlds. I was in my dress uniform, the medals on my chest feeling heavier than usual. I thought, just for a moment, that I might finally be seen. The general was kind, asking me about my service with genuine interest. I began to recount a carefully chosen, sanitized story about navigating a supply convoy through a hostile region. I was halfway through my sentence when Avery interrupted, letting out a perfectly timed, dismissive laugh. "Oh, Tegan, don't scare the man," she said, waving her hand as if shooing away a fly. "My little sister has such a vivid imagination." The table fell silent. The general looked uncomfortable. My face burned with humiliation. But Avery wasn't done. She leaned across the table, her eyes glinting with malice, and lowered her voice just enough so that only the general and I could hear her clearly. "Don't try to be something you're not," she hissed. "There's a name for that, you know. It's called stolen valor. To be accused of the most shameful sin a soldier can commit, pretending to be a hero you aren't, by my own sister, in front of a decorated general, was a violation so profound it left me breathless. It was a strategic, character-assassinating strike, and it hit its target perfectly. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, my uniform suddenly feeling like a costume. Later that night, after the guests had left, I confronted my father in his study. The room smelled of old leather and his favorite scotch. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't defend me. He poured himself a glass of Lagavulin, swirled the amber liquid, and looked at me not as a father, but as a crisis manager. "Tegan, you have to understand the game," he said, his voice calm and utterly detached. "Avery was protecting the family brand. Your war stories. They don't sell in this town. They make people uncomfortable." He took a slow sip. "Patriotism doesn't pay the lobbying bills. New defense contracts do." And there it was. The final, brutal truth laid bare under the soft lamplight of his study. I wasn't his daughter. I was a poorly performing asset, a narrative that was damaging the brand. My service, my sacrifices, my very identity. They were all just commodities to be weighed for their market value in Washington, D.C. And my value was zero. That was the moment the emotional bond truly severed. It wasn't a loud snap, but a quiet, cold decay. I realized that my family wasn't a family, it was a corporation. And I had just been deemed a bad investment. If you've ever had a moment, big or small, where your accomplishment was brushed aside by the people who should have been the proudest, press that like button. And in the comments, just type a simple, I understand. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone is the first step toward building your own victory. The rejection from my father that night was a form of disownment long before the envelope at 1789 made it official. He wasn't just dismissing my career, he was dismissing my entire being. And it was then that a new thought began to form in the back of my mind. A cold, hard piece of strategic calculus. If every victory I earned was worthless in their eyes, then I had to build a kind of victory they couldn't possibly ignore. The decision to build my own kind of victory led me to a place my family could never understand or control. Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Basic training. For them, it was a source of shame. For me, it was a liberation. The first day, breathing in the humid air, thick with the smell of pine needles and sweat, I felt a strange sense of peace. The world of Georgetown, with its hushed negotiations and unspoken hierarchies, felt a million miles away. Here, the hierarchy was loud, abrasive, and beautifully, brutally simple. The name Woods meant nothing. No one cared that my father had senators on speed dial. My value was stripped down to its rawest components. How many push-ups I could do until my arms screamed, how tightly I could group my shots on the rifle range, and how fast I could haul myself and my gear over the next obstacle. The mud, the yelling, the sheer physical exhaustion. It was a crucible designed to burn away everything that was non-essential. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on level ground. I'll never forget the moment our drill sergeant, a man whose voice could peel paint off a wall, stopped in front of me after a grueling 16-hour day. I was covered in mud, my muscles trembling, certain I was about to get chewed out for something. He just looked at my rifle, which I'd spent an hour cleaning, then looked me dead in the eye and gave a single, sharp nod. That nod, that silent, hard-earned acknowledgement from a man who demanded nothing less than perfection, was more real, more valuable than any hollow praise my mother had ever given me. It was a currency of respect, earned with sweat and grit, and I was finally solvent. That sense of belonging only deepened when I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My life became a routine of early mornings, tactical briefings, and the constant smell of gun oil and burnt coffee. It was a world away from the perfumed galas of DC, and I had never felt more at home. The heart of this new home was the dining facility, the DFAC. A loud, cavernous hall where the food was forgettable, but the company was everything. One evening, I was sitting at a long table with my squad, eating what was probably my 1,000th plate of dry turkey and lumpy mashed potatoes. But the food didn't matter. To my right was Miller, a farm kid from Iowa who could fix anything with duct tape and a prayer. Across from me was Diaz, a sharp-witted girl from the Bronx who missed her grandmother's cooking more than anything. We were laughing, sharing stupid jokes, talking about our families back home, our hopes, our fears. The air was warm with an easy camaraderie, a bond forged in shared hardship and mutual reliance. In that moment, surrounded by the clatter of trays and the chorus of laughter, I realized with a sudden pang in my chest, this was a family dinner. Just then, my phone vibrated on the table. It was a text from Avery. There were no words, just a picture. It was her smiling brilliantly at a table in what was clearly a Michelin-starred restaurant in New York City. She was holding up a glass of champagne, a plate of impossibly intricate food in front of her. The caption simply read, Le Bernardin. You wouldn't get it. I stared at the screen, the stark contrast hitting me like a physical blow. Her world of curated perfection against my world of messy, authentic connection. The loneliness was a sharp, bitter taste in my mouth, more potent than the bad coffee. She wasn't just sharing a picture, she was reinforcing the wall between us, reminding me that I was on the outside, in a place she considered beneath her. That feeling of isolation was never more acute than on Thanksgiving. I was on duty, thousands of miles from home. I managed to get a few minutes to call my family, hoping for a sliver of connection on a day that's all about it. The phone rang, and my mother answered, her voice bright and distant. "Tegan, 1 second, let me put you on speaker." Suddenly my ear was filled with the cacophony of a large party. Laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, the hum of dozens of conversations. It was the annual Woods Thanksgiving gathering for DC's Powerful. "Tegan, honey, you've called at such a busy time," my mother shouted over the noise. "Everyone here says hello." A meaningless platitude. My father's voice cut in, impatient and brief. "Try to stay safe, Tegan. Senator Thompson is here. I need to go speak with him." And that was it. Before I could even say, "Happy Thanksgiving," the call was over. Less than a minute. I was a duty, a box to be checked, less important than a handshake with a politician. I hung up the phone, the silence of the operations center pressing in on me. I felt a familiar hollowness spread through my chest. A moment later, Sergeant Miller, the farm kid from Iowa, walked over to my desk. He placed a paper plate in front of me. On it was a generous slice of pumpkin pie from the care packages his mom had sent. "Hey, Woods," he said with a small smile. "Your slice. Didn't want you to miss out on our family dinner." That simple act of kindness, that small piece of pie on a flimsy paper plate, held more warmth, more genuine care than my entire transatlantic phone call. He saw me. They saw me. My value here wasn't conditional. I wasn't an asset or a liability. I was just Woods. One of them. One of the family. That night, back in my small barracks room, I couldn't sleep. The contrast of the day, the stark difference between the family I was born into and the one I had found, churned in my mind. I started thinking about the mission reports I'd been analyzing for weeks. Reports detailing how shipments of critical medical supplies were being delayed or lost in transit, leading to preventable casualties. It was a logistics problem, a data problem, a problem of inefficiency and poor planning. My mind drifted to my father, to the effortless way he could analyze Senate voting patterns to predict a bill's outcome. I thought of Avery and her meticulous, brilliant way of constructing a legal case, brick by logical brick. I had that same analytical mind. They had just never thought to look for it or had dismissed it when they saw it. They had taught me the tools of strategy and analysis, never imagining I would use them for something other than climbing the social ladder in DC. A new kind of energy surged through me, not anger, but purpose. I grabbed my standard issue green notebook, the one I used for mission notes. I started sketching out a system, a network of intersecting data points. Supply chains, weather patterns, local intelligence reports, troop movements. I drew flowcharts and wrote algorithms, the ideas coming faster than I could write them down. I called it Project Chimera. It was more than just a software concept. It was the culmination of everything I was, the analytical mind inherited from my father, the discipline forged by the Army, and the deep, burning desire to protect the people who actually valued me. It was my answer to their dismissal. It was me, taking my seat at the table. If they wouldn't give me a place on their board, I would create my own. Project Chimera stopped being just scribbles in a notebook. For 2 years, it became my entire world outside of my regular duties. I poured every spare moment, every ounce of analytical energy I inherited from my father, into building it. And it worked. In simulations, it was flawless. My commanding officer saw its potential and, to my utter astonishment, selected me to present it at the largest defense exposition in the country, the Association of the United States Army Annual Symposium. AUSI. The universe, it seems, has a twisted sense of humor. The conference was being held at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center, right in the heart of my hometown. The city that had rejected me was now the stage for my biggest professional moment. Out of a lingering, foolish sense of duty, I sent an invitation to my family. I didn't expect them to come, but I felt I had to try. The response came not from them, but from my father's impeccably polite secretary, an email. Mr. Woods extends his regrets but is unable to attend due to a scheduling conflict. A scheduling conflict. I was presenting a revolutionary logistics system to the leaders of the U.S. Army. And my own father had a scheduling conflict. The sting was familiar, but duller this time. It was just more data to file away. Standing backstage, waiting for my name to be called, I looked out at the vast auditorium. It was a sea of dress uniforms glittering with medals and dark, expensive suits worn by CEOs from every major defense contractor in the world. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. They were all here. I felt a familiar pang of loneliness, a small, quiet sergeant about to address a room full of generals and titans of industry. But then a new feeling pushed the loneliness aside: resolve. I wasn't here to impress my family anymore. I was here for the soldiers whose lives this could save. I was here for myself. My name was called. I walked to the podium, the bright stage lights warm on my face. My heart was pounding, a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the hundreds of faces staring back at me. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and steady. "My name is Sergeant Tegan Woods. Today, I'm not going to talk about abstract strategies or defense policy. I'm going to talk about saving lives with better data." I didn't use the flowery, persuasive language my father favored. I used the language of the military: direct, efficient, and fact-based. I let the data do the fighting. My first slide was a stark map of a recent conflict zone. Red dots appeared on the screen. "Each of these dots represents a preventable casualty," I said, my voice ringing with conviction. "Soldiers we lost not to enemy fire, but to a delayed shipment of blood plasma or a missing batch of antibiotics." The room was silent. I moved through my presentation with practiced precision, showing charts, running simulations. I demonstrated how Project Chimera's predictive algorithm could analyze thousands of variables: weather patterns, local political instability, insurgent activity, convoy vulnerabilities, to anticipate supply chain disruptions before they happened. I showed them, with hard numbers, how many of those red dots could have remained just names on a roster, men and women who would have come home. I never said I created, I said the system demonstrates. I made myself a conduit for the information, for the mission. Throughout my 20-minute presentation, I noticed one man in the front row. He was older, with a lean, weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes that never left the screen. He wasn't in uniform, but he had the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. He didn't take a single note. He just watched, his expression unreadable, absorbing every piece of data. I recognized him from the conference program. Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Axiom Dynamics, a powerhouse in defense technology, and a former Green Beret. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the applause started. It was solid, respectful. I gave a slight nod. My duty done. As I was packing up my laptop at the side of the stage, a shadow fell over me. It was Marcus Thorne. I braced myself for the usual polite, dismissive platitudes, but his first words weren't praise. "Your supply chain predictive algorithm," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Does it account for localized political volatility as a weighted variable?" I was taken aback. It was a deeply technical question, one that went straight to the heart of my system. "Yes, sir," I replied, my analyst brain kicking into gear. It cross-references State Department advisories and on-the-ground intelligence reports to create a stability index that dynamically adjusts route risk. He nodded, a flicker of something, respect, in his eyes. For the next 10 minutes, we stood there, surrounded by the buzz of the conference, having the most intense, intellectually stimulating conversation of my life. He fired off questions about data sourcing, encryption, and scalability. He didn't talk down to me. He spoke to me as a peer. He spoke to me with a level of intellectual respect my own father, the brilliant strategist, had never once afforded me. "Walk with me, Sergeant," he said finally. We ended up in a small coffee shop across the street from the convention center, the noise of the city a dull roar outside the window. He told me about his time in the service, about losing a good man in his unit not to a bullet, but to an infection because a simple antibiotic didn't make it to their outpost in time. His story was filled with a quiet, profound pain that I understood completely. He looked at me, his gaze direct and unwavering. "What you've built," he said, his voice thick with conviction, is what I needed 20 years ago. It's what soldiers need right now. He leaned forward slightly. Axiom Dynamics wants to acquire the technology. We're prepared to offer $9.5 million. The number just hung in the air between us. $9.5 million. My mind struggled to process it. It was an absurd, life-altering figure. But as the shock began to subside, I realized it wasn't the money that was making my hands tremble. It was the validation. It was the number attached to my worth, a value assigned not by my blood, but by my mind, by my work. The offer, he continued, as if he knew what I was thinking, comes with a condition. We don't just want the system, we want the architect. We'll create a new division for you to run it, Director of Strategic Analysis. Director? The word echoed in my head. I looked out the window at the imposing marble buildings of Washington, D.C., the symbols of a power structure that had always excluded me. My family had spent their lives playing a game within those walls, a game of influence and image. And in a single afternoon, in a coffee shop with a stranger who saw what they never could, I had just built my own power, a different kind, one based not on who I knew, but on what I could do. Marcus Thorne looked at me, waiting for an answer. He saw a sergeant. He saw an analyst. He had no idea he was also looking at a weapon that was finally being armed. He broke the silence. Sergeant Woods, what you have here isn't just a project. It's a revolution. And I want to invest in that revolution. Tell me what you need. Marcus Thorne's final question, tell me what you need, was the order that activated my new mission. The weeks that followed were a covert operation conducted from my barracks room at Fort Bragg. My life became a study in duality. By day, I was Sergeant Woods, running drills and analyzing intelligence reports. By night, I was Tegan Woods, the soon-to-be Director of Strategic Analysis, engaging in a different kind of warfare, corporate negotiation. The team from Axiom Dynamics was formidable. A trio of sharp, Harvard-educated lawyers who were used to getting their way. Our negotiations took place over a series of encrypted video calls. My bland barracks wall a stark contrast to their polished corner offices. They probably expected an easily impressed soldier, grateful for the opportunity. They didn't get one. I had spent years analyzing complex tactical situations. A legal contract was just another battlefield with its own rules of engagement. I read Sun Tzu's The Art of War at night, not for military strategy, but for this. Know your enemy and know yourself, he wrote. I treated Axiom's legal team not as an enemy, but as a strategic challenge. I dissected every clause of their initial offer, cross-referencing it with industry standards I'd researched obsessively. I wasn't just a soldier, I was my father's daughter. I knew how to analyze a document for weaknesses. I pushed back not just on salary, but on budget allocation for my future division, on intellectual property rights for future applications of the Chimera system, and on the exact wording of my autonomy within the corporate structure. During one late-night call, their lead counsel paused, a look of grudging respect on his face. Sergeant, he said, you could have a hell of a career in law. I didn't smile. I'm happy with the one I have, sir, I replied. Let's just make sure this contract reflects its value. I was no longer the girl hoping for a crumb of validation. I was a professional, calmly and methodically securing my position, all in absolute secrecy. As the deal with Axiom neared its conclusion, I found myself drawn to another secret I'd kept for years. On my laptop, buried under layers of encryption, was a folder I'd named Woods Intel. It was my private museum of dismissals, the one I spoke of earlier, but in digital form. For over a decade, I'd been unconsciously gathering intelligence. I wasn't a victim who cried. I was a soldier who documented. After every slight, every dismissive comment, every broken promise, I would save the evidence. An email from my mother praising Avery's law school achievements while ignoring my promotion. A screenshot of a text message from my sister mocking my uniform. A note I'd made to myself, time-stamped, detailing a promise from my father to visit me on base that was casually broken for a golf game with a congressman. I opened the folder now, the final contract from Axiom sitting in my inbox, waiting to be signed. I scrolled through the files, not with anger, but with a cold sense of clarity. There it was. Years of data points, forming an undeniable pattern of emotional neglect and strategic marginalization. This folder wasn't for revenge. It was my justification. It was the mission briefing that reminded me why this operation was necessary. It was proof that this relationship wasn't salvageable, that it had been a one-sided ceasefire for far too long. This wasn't about hurting them. It was about ending my own slow death by 1,000 cuts. A few days before the final pieces fell into place, my phone rang. It was Avery. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice intentionally neutral. "Hello, Avery." Her voice was dripping with the condescending authority she always used with me. "Tegan, I'm just calling to remind you about dinner on Friday night. It's important. Mom and Dad have something they need to discuss with you." There was a pause, and then the inevitable jab. "Try to dress the part, would you? Leave the Army-Navy store, look at home for once." A year ago, that comment would have stung. Tonight, it made me smile. A small, private, genuine smile. She was still issuing orders, still believed she was the one in control of the board. She had no idea she wasn't a player anymore. She was just a target, completely unaware that my targeting solution had been locked in for weeks. She thought she was setting an ambush, when in reality, she was walking straight into mine. "I'll be there, Avery," I said calmly. "Thanks for the reminder." I hung up before she could say another word. The next day, the final revised contract from Axiom arrived in my secure email. The operation had reached its final stage. I drove off base to a FedEx office in Fayetteville, the closest town. I needed a secure printer and a moment of quiet ceremony. The hum of the commercial printer was the only sound in the small store. As the pages slid into the tray, warm from the machine, I felt a sense of profound calm. This wasn't just a contract, it was my declaration of independence. I sat down at a small table, took out my own pen, and signed my name on the final page. Not Sergeant Tegan Woods, just Tegan Woods. It was a statement. I was entering this new phase of my life on my own terms, under my own name. I scanned the signed document and emailed it back to the Axiom legal team. The first part of the mission was complete. An hour later, as I was driving back to Fort Bragg, my phone pinged with a new email. It was from my father's secretary, the same one who had relayed his scheduling conflict. The subject line was, "Dinner Friday, 1789. Restaurant." The message was brief, confirming our 7:30 p.m. reservation. I pulled over to the side of the road. I read the email once, then twice. It was the summons, the invitation to my own execution. I knew with every fiber of my being that this was a trap. This was where they planned to deliver the final, crushing blow. But I wasn't afraid of traps anymore. Sun Tzu wrote, "In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity." They thought they were setting the terms of my surrender. They didn't know I was the one who had already planned the entire war. I opened my email reply. My fingers were steady as I typed a single word. Confirmed. I sent the message. Then I put the car in drive. That night, I didn't clean my rifle. I went through my civilian clothes and calmly selected a simple, elegant navy blue dress. Then, I took the printed, signed Axiom contract and placed it carefully inside a sleek, dark blue portfolio. Everything was ready. All the pieces were in place. The operation was a go. Before the contract, before the AUSA conference, before I ever conceived of Project Chimera, there was a moment in Afghanistan that burned away the last remnants of hope I had for my family. It was the point of no return. It was the incident that loaded the weapon I would later learn to aim. We were stationed at Bagram Airfield. The air was thin and choked with dust. 2 days earlier, we had lost Corporal Miller in an ambush. He was 19. A kid from Ohio who had just gotten a picture of his newborn niece, which he carried in his helmet liner. As his sergeant, I was part of the chain of command that had to make the calls, to speak the unspeakable to families back home. The weight of that duty, of that loss, was a physical presence, a crushing pressure on my chest. We were preparing for his memorial service, a ramp ceremony to honor him before his body began the long journey home. The grief in our unit was a thick, silent fog. In the middle of this profound sorrow, I checked my email on a slow satellite connection. A new message from Avery popped up. The subject line was bright and cheerful. Big news. I opened it. The text was brief and bubbly. I'm engaged. He proposed last night. We're having the party at the Chevy Chase Club this weekend. Don't worry about coming home for it. It's probably not your scene anyway. Just wanted to let you know. Attached was a photo. Avery, radiant in a white dress, was holding up her left hand. A diamond the size of a small rock glittered on her finger. Beside her, her fiancé, a handsome investment banker with a perfect smile, beamed at the camera. They were the picture of DC perfection. I looked at the photo, then I looked around me. I was in my quarters, my dress uniform hanging crisply on the back of the door, ready for the ceremony. Through my window, I could see soldiers from my platoon gathering, their faces etched with a grief too deep for words. Men were quietly crying for their fallen brother. The jarring contrast between my two realities was so violent it made me feel nauseous. Avery's world of champagne, diamonds, and country club parties felt like a fiction from another planet. A planet where a 19-year-old boy's life wasn't worth a moment's thought. The casual cruelty of her email, "It's probably not your scene anyway," was a calculated dismissal, a neat and tidy exclusion to keep her perfect party atmosphere from being tainted by the inconvenient reality of my life. Despite it all, a small stupid part of me, the part that still wanted a mother, made me pick up the sat phone. I needed to hear a familiar voice. I needed some small measure of comfort, a lifeline to a world where people weren't dying. My mother answered, her voice rushed and airy. "Tegan, what is it?" "I'm in the middle of planning Avery's engagement party." I took a breath, the dust scratching the back of my throat. "Mom," I said, my voice low, "we lost one of my men." "A corporal?" "He was 19. The silence on the other end of the line was not empathetic. It was impatient. "Oh, that's just awful, dear," she finally said, the words a hollow recitation. "But you have to understand, this is Avery's moment. Can you please not ruin the family's joy with your sad stories? All of the focus needs to be on your sister right now." I went completely still. The phone felt like a block of ice against my ear. She hadn't just dismissed my pain. She had forbidden it. She had ordered me to be silent, to swallow my grief so that it wouldn't cast a shadow on a party. My world, a world of life and death and sacrifice, was just a sad story. An inconvenient narrative that clashed with the celebratory mood she was curating. Corporal Miller's death wasn't a tragedy to her. It was a potential party foul. I don't remember saying goodbye. I think I just let the phone fall from my hand. I stood up and walked over to the small cracked mirror hanging on the wall. I looked at my own reflection, at the tired, hollowed-out eyes staring back. I looked at the uniform I was wearing. My gaze settled on the American flag patch stitched onto my right sleeve. The red, white, and blue seemed to stand out in sharp relief. I thought of Corporal Miller. I thought of his infectious, goofy grin. I thought of the parents in Ohio who were about to have their world shattered. The soldier's creed echoed in my head. I will never leave a fallen comrade. We live and die by that creed. It's a sacred promise, and in that moment, I realized that my family had left me behind years ago. They had abandoned me on a spiritual and emotional battlefield, deeming me and my world unworthy of their attention or respect. The silence they demanded of me was no longer something I would endure. It was something I would now wield. The silence they wanted to protect their party would become the silence I would use to plan my war. There are some lines that should never be crossed. For me, disrespecting a fallen soldier was that line. If you agree, do me a favor and hit that like button as a small sign of respect for those who have served. And in the comments, just type, "Respect the fallen." It's a way of saying, together, that some things are more important than parties. Staring at my reflection, I made a silent vow. I would never again offer them the most important parts of myself. I would never again share my pain, my triumphs, or my heart with people who saw it all as an inconvenience. The warrior's ethos is to protect your own. My family had made it clear they were not my own. From that day forward, I would build a fortress around my heart. I would stop trying to save a mission that was already lost. And from inside that fortress, I would begin to plan the final battle. They didn't just disrespect me, they disrespected the fallen. This game had to end. Marcus Thorne's offer wasn't an endpoint, it was the beginning of a new, high-stakes campaign. What followed was a masterclass in strategic negotiation, a quiet war fought over encrypted video calls and endless legal documents. Axiom's legal team presented me with a standard acquisition contract, a boilerplate document designed to favor the corporation. They clearly underestimated me. I spent my nights in the base library, not reading fiction, but studying corporate law and intellectual property rights. I drew inspiration from women like Marilyn Hewson, the former CEO of Lockheed Martin, women who had thrived in the male-dominated world of defense and technology. I would not be intimidated. In our final negotiation, I sat in my small, stark barracks room, facing a screen of 3 of the sharpest corporate lawyers in the country. Marcus Thorne was also patched in, a silent observer. I calmly presented my counter-proposal, a document I drafted and redrafted a dozen times. I pointed to Clause 7B, regarding future development rights. This language is too ambiguous, I stated, my voice even. I want explicit ownership of any non-military applications derived from the core Chimera algorithm. They were stunned into silence. One of the lawyers finally sputtered, "Sergeant, that's highly irregular." "The technology is highly irregular," I countered. "It has potential applications in commercial shipping, disaster relief, and global pandemic response. That potential has value. I want that value recognized." I didn't just want a payout, I was building a future. I negotiated for a guaranteed operational budget for my new division for the first 3 years. I negotiated for full autonomy in hiring my own team. With every point I won, I felt a layer of the old, insecure Tegan sloughing away. On the screen, I could see Marcus Thorne trying and failing to hide a smile. He wasn't watching a soldier accept a deal. He was watching a leader forge one. During the due diligence phase, a small but powerful event solidified my resolve. My code was being reviewed by Axiom's top engineers. One afternoon, I received a private, encrypted email from an address I didn't recognize. The message was short from one of their senior tech analysts. "Sergeant Woods," it read. "I'm a 20-year Army vet, signal intelligence. Your predictive modeling is the most elegant and effective piece of coding I've seen in my entire career. Don't let these suits lowball you." This is brilliant. That email from a fellow soldier, a nameless, faceless ally who simply recognized the quality of the work, was like a shot of adrenaline to the soul. It was pure validation, untainted by politics or family dynamics. It came from someone who understood. It was all the reinforcement I needed. As the date for the dinner at 1789 approached, the lawyer Axiom had recommended for me, a sharp man named Ben Carter, suggested something unusual. "Let's do a war game," he said over the phone. "A rehearsal. I'll play your father. I'll use every psychological tactic I think he'll use. Don't hold back." We met in his office the next day. Ben, a man who was normally calm and professional, transformed. He sat across the conference table from me and adopted my father's posture, that arrogant, dismissive lean. "Tegan," he began, his voice dripping with disappointment, "after everything we've given you, this is how you repay us? You're tearing this family apart for your own selfish ambition." The attack was so sudden, so accurate, that for a split second I felt that old, familiar knot of guilt tighten in my stomach. I faltered. "No, no," Ben said, breaking character. "Don't engage the emotion. That's his battlefield, and he'll win every time. Respond like you're in a briefing. Data, facts, stay in your territory." We did it again. This time, when he launched the attack, I was ready. "You're tearing this family apart," he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet office. I kept my voice level, my hands steady on the table. "The decision to dissolve our legal and financial ties was initiated by you, As I'm sure your legal counsel has advised you, I said, as if reporting the weather. My professional life is a separate matter, based entirely on the merits of my work. We ran through a dozen scenarios: guilt trips, threats about my mother's health, appeals to family loyalty. Each time, I learned to deflect, to reframe, to stay grounded in the undeniable facts of the situation. By the end of the hour, I was exhausted, but I was also armored. The dinner was no longer a dreaded family confrontation. It was a strategic negotiation, and I had just drilled for it relentlessly. The day of the dinner was the day everything came together. The final contracts were signed, the deal with Axiom was officially closed. That afternoon, 2 emails arrived in my inbox almost simultaneously. The first was from my father's secretary, a crisp, final confirmation of our 7:30 p.m. reservation. The second was from a name I didn't recognize: Wells Fargo Private Bank. My heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked it open. It was a secure message informing me that a wire transfer had been completed. Per my lawyer's instructions, a new account had been opened in my name. I clicked the attached PDF to view the statement. The document loaded, clean, and official. At the top of the page, under Current Balance, was a number that didn't seem real. $9,500,000. I stared at it. I expected to feel a surge of wild, life-changing joy. I thought I would want to shout, or laugh, or cry. Instead, what washed over me was a profound and absolute calm. It was the quiet confidence of a soldier who has just been handed a fully loaded weapon, right before walking into a fight. It was the final confirmation. I had the resources. I had the strategic position. I had the psychological armor. I was ready. I looked at the number on the screen, the long line of zeros stretching after the name Tegan Woods. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was ammunition. I arrived at 1789 at precisely 7:30 p.m. Punctuality is a military virtue. I was wearing the simple navy blue dress I had chosen, its quiet elegance a form of armor. It radiated a silent power they wouldn't understand until it was too late. I saw them at the same table, a tableau of smug authority. My father, the king. My mother, the queen. And my sister, the heir apparent, ready to witness the exile of the family disappointment. I sat down, my movements calm and deliberate. I was not a defendant arriving for sentencing. I was a commander arriving to observe a battlefield of my own choosing. I let them play out their script. I listened to my father's carefully rehearsed speech about divergent paths and the integrity of the Woods legacy. I endured my mother's saccharine lecture on public image and expectations. I watched Avery, her phone held discreetly in her lap, angled perfectly to capture the moment of my anticipated breakdown. I was an actress in their little drama, and I was determined to give the performance of a lifetime by doing nothing at all. When the waiter brought my appetizer, a seared tuna salad, I picked up my fork and began to eat. Slowly, deliberately. I savored each bite, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to wait. I could feel their impatience radiating across the table. This was not part of their plan. They wanted tears, pleading, anger. I was giving them dinner etiquette. Finally, my mother, unable to wait any longer, produced the white envelope. The weapon. She slid it across the table with the finality of a judge passing sentence. The entire performance had been building to this moment. I finished my bite of tuna. I placed my fork down gently. I picked up the envelope. I didn't tear it open. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it neatly. I unfolded the document inside, my eyes scanning the cold, legal phrases they had chosen to end our family. Notice of familial waiver. Relinquishes all rights. Waives any and all claims. It was all there, just as I had anticipated. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the red dot of Avery's phone camera recording. I heard her triumphant whisper to my mother, "Got it." I took a deep breath, not of sorrow, but of resolve. This was it, the point of engagement. I folded the document with military precision, the creases sharp enough to cut. I placed the folded paper on the table. Then I looked up, meeting my father's gaze directly. I gave him the same sharp nod my drill sergeant had given me years ago, a nod of acknowledgement, of mission completion. Received, I said. My voice was a flat, emotionless monotone. The word hung in the air, completely derailing their script. They were stunned. This wasn't the reaction they had rehearsed for. They had prepared for a sobbing daughter, not a stoic soldier. Avery was the first to break. Her smug smile vanished, replaced by confusion. You said, received? She stammered, her phone lowering slightly. That was my signal. The counter-offensive was now greenlit. Slowly, I reached down and brought my slim, dark blue portfolio onto the table. I didn't toss it. I placed it. The sound it made on the polished mahogany was soft, but it landed with the weight of an artillery shell. My father's eyes, the eyes of a master negotiator, were immediately drawn to it. I unzipped the portfolio and slid out a document. It wasn't a single sheet of paper. It was a thick, professionally bound proposal. On the cover, in elegant silver lettering, was the logo of Axiom Dynamics. I slid it across the table, a mirror image of my mother's earlier action. It stopped directly in front of my father. While you were all drafting this, I said, my voice still level, still calm, gesturing to their white envelope, I was finalizing a different kind of agreement. My father, Charles Woods, who had read and dissected thousands of multi-million-dollar contracts in his career, snatched the portfolio as if it were a threat. His eyes, trained to find the fine print, the weaknesses, the loopholes, flew across the first page. I watched his face, my own expression unreadable. I observed the subtle shifts, the same way I would track enemy movements. First, there was smug dismissal. Then his eyes narrowed in confusion. Then they widened in disbelief. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He started mumbling, the words catching in his throat, his legendary composure shattering like glass. $9.5 million. Acquisition, Project Chimera. Director of Strategic Analysis. My mother, hearing the numbers, leaned over his shoulder. Her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent gasp. Her hand, adorned with the cold diamond, flew to her mouth, trembling. She looked from the paper to me, her eyes wide with a horror that was, for the first time, completely genuine. And Avery. My triumphant, cruel sister. She was frozen solid. Her phone, the instrument of my intended humiliation, slipped from her limp fingers and clattered onto the upholstered seat beside her. The small red light went out. The show was over. The world they had so carefully constructed, a world where they were the arbiters of value, the sole gatekeepers of success, had just been obliterated before their very eyes. They had tried to fire me from a family I no longer wanted, only to discover I'd just been hired to run a revolution they couldn't even comprehend. I let the silence sit. I let the truth do its work. There was nothing more for me to say. Insulting them now would be a waste of ammunition on a target that had already been neutralized. I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound on the floor. I straightened my dress. I reached over and picked up their white envelope, their pathetic little legal weapon. I held it for a moment, then gently slid it back across the table to them. You should keep this, I said. There was no malice in my voice, only finality. It's no longer valid. I turned and looked at each of them one last time. They were statues, frozen in their own private hell of miscalculation. I have my own new orders now. And with that, I turned my back on them for the last time. I walked away, my posture straight, my pace steady. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Behind me, I left a silence so profound, so absolute, that it swallowed the entire room. It was the silence of their power turning to ash. The only sound was the crisp, steady rhythm of my footsteps on the hardwood floor, walking away from the wreckage and into my future. The moment I stepped out of the 1789 restaurant and into the cool DC night air, my phone began to buzz. It was a frantic, desperate vibration against my palm. The aftershocks of the earthquake I had just triggered were already beginning. The first was a text from Avery. It came through before I'd even reached the street corner. Tegan, wait, we need to talk. The words were a stark contrast to the smug silence she'd maintained just minutes earlier. Then came the barrage from my mother, a series of rapid-fire texts riddled with typos, a digital reflection of her panic. "Tegan, please come back. We can discuss this. It's a misunderstanding." And finally, as I sat in the back of a taxi heading to my temporary apartment, an email from my father. His was, as always, concise and strategic. The subject line? Urgent. The body of the email: "We need to have a family meeting to clarify the situation." I read them all, one by one, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. I observed the shift in their language with the detached interest of an analyst. The tone of command was gone. The condescension had vanished. In their place was a new vocabulary. "Wait, please, we need." It was the language of people who had just lost control. Power hadn't just shifted, it had undergone a tectonic upheaval. I read every message, and I answered none of them. Back in my small, sparsely furnished apartment, I didn't open a bottle of champagne. I didn't call a friend to celebrate. I simply took off my shoes, sat down in the single armchair in the living room, and let the silence of the room settle around me. I had expected to feel a surge of triumphant joy, a cathartic release, but that wasn't what came. Instead, what I felt was a vast, quiet, and profound sense of relief. It was the feeling of a soldier finally setting down a rucksack she'd been carrying for 38 years, a weight she hadn't even fully realized was there until it was gone. The constant low-grade tension of waiting for the next dismissal, the next subtle insult, the next act of casual cruelty. It had all vanished. The war was over. And all that was left was the quiet. My phone buzzed again. Another desperate text from Avery. I looked at the device, this small rectangle that had become the primary channel for their panicked attempts to regain control. For years, their silence had been a punishment they inflicted on me. Now, my silence would be my sanctuary. With a deliberate movement, I powered the phone completely off. I chose the silence. It was no longer a weapon or a punishment. It was peace. A few days later, there was a sharp, insistent knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find Avery standing in the hallway. The change in her was startling. The razor-sharp, confident corporate lawyer was gone. In her place was a woman who looked lost, her usual impeccable composure replaced by a fidgety uncertainty. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I stepped aside, leaving the door open but not inviting her further. She walked into the center of the room, looking around at the bare walls as if they were a foreign country. She turned to face me, wringing her hands. "We were wrong," she began, the words sounding clumsy and rehearsed. I didn't know. I mean, if I had known you were capable of that." And in that moment, I understood everything. Her apology wasn't for the years of cruelty, for the public humiliation, for the stolen valor comment. It wasn't for being a terrible sister. It was the apology of a defeated strategist. She was sorry she had miscalculated my strength. She was sorry she had underestimated her opponent. She was apologizing for losing, not for being wrong. The regret in her eyes wasn't for my pain. It was for her own strategic blunder. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt. Just a calm, sad clarity. The hope for a real sister, a hope I had secretly carried for decades, finally flickered and died. It was a quiet, painless death. "Thank you for stopping by, Avery," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "But the meeting is over." I walked to the door and held it open. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a new legal argument, a new angle of attack. But there was none. She had no more moves to make. Defeated, she walked out. I closed the door softly behind her, the click of the lock a final, definitive sound. A boundary had just been set, not with anger, but with peace. Later that evening, I took out the white envelope from the dinner, their notice of familial waiver. I unfolded it and read it one last time. The words no longer had any power over me. They were just ink on a piece of high-quality paper, a relic from a forgotten war. I walked over to a simple wooden footlocker I kept at the end of my bed. It was where I stored the few things that truly mattered from my military career. I opened the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet, was my Army Commendation Medal, the little medal my mother had once found so sweet. Next to it were photos of my squad, letters from home from my Army buddies, and the neatly folded flag from Corporal Miller's memorial service. I took their letter, their official act of disownment, and I placed it in the box, right next to the medal they had dismissed. I didn't tear it up. I didn't burn it. I archived it. I placed it where it belonged, in the past. It was no longer a source of pain. It was now an artifact, a data point, a lesson learned from a completed campaign. I closed the lid of the box. The past was now in its proper place, filed away and cataloged. My mission was complete. I was finally, truly, honorably discharged. And I was ready for my next assignment, living my own life. 6 months after that dinner at 1789, I stood in my new office on the top floor of the Axiom Dynamics building. It was a world of glass and steel and light. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the entire panorama of Washington, D.C. spread out below me. The monuments, the federal buildings, the Potomac River gleaming in the morning sun. It was the same city, the same geography of power my family had always worshipped. But for the first time, I wasn't looking up at it from the outside. I was a part of it, on my own terms. On the polished surface of my large oak desk, a simple, elegant nameplate rested. It read, Tegan Woods, Director of Strategic Analysis. My title, my name. Earned, not inherited. The door opened and Marcus Thorne walked in, a warm smile on his face. He extended a hand. Welcome to the team, Director, he said, his voice emphasizing my new title with genuine respect. I shook his hand, my grip firm, and a real smile, a truly effortless smile, spread across my face. It's good to be here, Marcus. This was where I belonged. Not in the suffocating drawing rooms of Georgetown, but here, in a place built on innovation and merit, where my value was recognized every single day. The money from the Axiom deal was more than I could ever have imagined, but I knew from the start that it wasn't just for me. It was a resource. It was ammunition, as I'd thought before, but not for a war that was already over. It was for building something new. 2 months after starting at Axiom, I used a significant portion of the funds to establish a foundation. I called it the Corporal Miller Legacy Fund. Its mission was simple: to provide full-ride scholarships for the children of fallen service members who wanted to pursue degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It was my way of honoring the boy from Ohio. It was my way of turning a tragedy into a legacy of hope. Last week, I had the privilege of meeting the fund's first recipient. Her name was Sarah, a bright, fiercely intelligent 17-year-old girl whose father, an Army captain, had been killed in Iraq 10 years ago. We met for coffee, and she spoke with a passion that reminded me of myself at her age, telling me about her dream of becoming an aerospace engineer. As we were about to leave, she looked at me with tears welling in her eyes. My mom and we never thought college would be possible, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Because of you, because of this fund, I can actually follow my dream. You've changed my life. In that moment, I understood what a true legacy was. It wasn't a famous last name printed in the society pages. It wasn't a portfolio of stocks and political connections. It was the positive change you could create in someone else's life. It was the quiet, profound joy of helping a girl like Sarah reach for the stars in her father's honor. That was a legacy the Woods family, with all their money and power, would never understand. Life has a way of circling back on itself. Last Sunday, I was taking a walk through Rock Creek Park, enjoying the crisp autumn air. As I rounded a bend in the path, I saw a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench. It was my mother. She looked smaller, older. The proud imperial bearing she always carried was gone, replaced by a fragile weariness. She saw me, and her eyes widened. She stood up slowly. Tegan, she said, her voice hesitant, uncertain. It was the first time we had spoken since that night. I stopped, keeping a polite distance. I felt no anger, no resentment. All I felt was a distant, detached kind of pity. Your father, she began, looking down at her hands. He isn't well. The doctors are concerned. I recognized the move instantly. It was a probe. A weak, desperate attempt to use guilt as a key to a door I'd long since welded shut. The old me would have been torn apart, pulled back into the vortex of obligation and guilt. But the old me was gone. I looked at this woman, my mother, and I saw her simply as she was, a person in pain, trying to use the only tools she had. My heart didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. It simply held its ground. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and my voice was sincere. I hope he feels better soon. And that was all. I didn't offer to visit. I didn't promise to call. I didn't open the door for a reconciliation that could never happen. I was just polite, offering the same kindness one would offer to a stranger. I had finally, peacefully, established the ultimate boundary. She seemed to understand. She just nodded, turned, and walked away. This evening, I'm sitting on the balcony of my new apartment in the wharf, overlooking the water. The sun is setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. My phone rings. It's Marcus Thorne calling to brainstorm a new application for the Chimera system, this time for tracking global humanitarian aid shipments. We talk for 20 minutes, a dynamic, exciting exchange of ideas between colleagues, between peers. After I hang up, I don't find my eyes drawn to the distant monuments of power across the city. Instead, I watch the boats gliding across the darkening water. I take a sip of my hot tea, the warmth spreading through my chest. My family tried to write me out of their story. They tried to declare my chapter finished, to relegate me to a footnote. But they failed. Because in the end, I became the author of my own story. The best chapter is just beginning. The silence is no longer a battlefield. It's peace. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was mine. I learned that when others try to define your worth, the most powerful thing you can do is to pick up the pen and become the author of your own story. Your legacy is not what you're given, it's what you build. And your peace is worth fighting for. If you believe in the power of turning pain into purpose, please subscribe to this channel for more stories of strength and resilience. And if you know someone who needs to hear that their best chapter is still unwritten, share this story with them. Take care.